Look at the rainfall map of the United States. Then the population density map. Then the vegetation map. Then the map of average farm sizes. Even the map of federal land ownership. Look at each one carefully. They don't share a mountain range, a river, or a political border. But if you look long enough, each map seems to shift, to change register at roughly the same place. Somewhere in the middle of the country, cutting from north to south through the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, something is happening. Not a wall, not a fence, not even a road. Just a line, invisible on the ground, where the rules of the American landscape quietly change. That line is the 100th Meridian West. And the question of why it matters and what it means for the future of the United States is more urgent today than it has ever been. A meridian is simply a line of longitude, an imaginary north to south line drawn around the Earth. The 100th Meridian West sits almost exactly in the center of the contiguous United States, running from the Canadian border down through the Texas Panhandle and into the Gulf of Mexico. On the ground, there is nothing to mark it. No sign, no change in the road, no shift in the skyline. But in 1878, a geographer and explorer named John Wesley Powell noticed something. Powell had spent years mapping the American West, including a now famous boat journey down the Colorado River in 1869. When he compiled his findings into a landmark report to the U.S. government, he drew a line. He called it the boundary between the humid lands and the arid lands of North America. And that line ran almost exactly along the 100th meridian. Powell's argument was simple but radical. The eastern half of the country could support traditional farming. The western half could not, at least not in the same way. He warned that attempting to settle the arid West using the same land policies designed for the humid East would end in failure. His report was largely ignored. What followed, within 2 generations, was one of the largest agricultural disasters in American history. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s, centered almost precisely on the lands Powell had warned about. The reason the 100th meridian matters comes down to one number: 20 inches. 20 inches, roughly 500 millimeters, of annual rainfall is the approximate minimum required to grow crops without irrigation. East of the 100th meridian, most of the country receives more than 20 inches per year. West of it, across the Great Plains and into the interior, most of the land receives less. This isn't a coincidence of geography. It is a consequence of it. Moisture traveling inland from the Gulf of Mexico weakens the further north and west it moves. At the same time, the Rocky Mountains to the west act as a barrier against Pacific moisture. Storms moving in from the Pacific rise over the mountains, drop their rain on the western slopes, and arrive in the interior as dry air. The result is a vast interior region, stretching from the Dakotas to Texas, where rainfall is not only low, but deeply unpredictable. A farmer in Iowa can expect roughly 35 inches of rain a year, arriving with reasonable consistency through the growing season. A farmer 500 miles to the west in western Kansas might receive 15 inches, or 5, or 25, depending on the year. It is not just the quantity of water that changes near the 100th meridian. It is the reliability of it. The landscape registers this shift visibly. East of the line, forests, then tall grass prairie, then mixed grass prairie. Landscapes fed by consistent moisture. West of the line, short grass prairie, then semi-desert scrubland. Plants shaped by long dry spells and thin soils. Drive west across Nebraska on Interstate 80,
and you can feel the transition without a map. The trees thin out. The sky gets larger. The land flattens and pales.
By the time you reach the western third of the state, the landscape has become something categorically different from what you left behind in Omaha. Not just in appearance, but in what it can and cannot sustain. People over time settled where the land could support them. East of the 100th Meridian, reliable rainfall made small-scale farming viable, and the landscape filled with dense networks of farms, towns, and rural communities. West of the line, the calculation was different. Raising crops in a semi-arid environment required more land to produce the same output, or it required water that simply wasn't there. The result, accumulated over generations, is a population map that looks like it belongs to two different places. The eastern half of the United States holds the overwhelming majority of the country's population. West of the 100th Meridian, across the Great Plains, county after county falls below 6 people per square mile, the historical threshold demographers use to define frontier territory. Some counties in western Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas have fewer than 2. This is not because people haven't tried to live there. They have, and they left. Since the 1930s, hundreds of Great Plains counties have been losing population almost continuously. Towns that once had schools, banks, and newspapers have disappeared from the map entirely. The landscape is not empty because it was never settled. It is empty because settlement failed. The economies on either side of the 100th Meridian reflect the same underlying divide. East of the line, intensive agriculture, corn, soybeans, hogs, dairy, where reliable rain and fertile soil allow farmers to produce maximum output from relatively small plots of land. West of the line, extensive agriculture, wheat, cattle ranching, and increasingly industrial-scale irrigation, where the land demands you spread out simply to survive. The average farm in Iowa covers around 350 acres. The average ranch in western Texas covers thousands. But the most consequential economic story west of the 100th Meridian is not the land itself, it is the water beneath it. The Ogallala Aquifer is one of the largest underground freshwater reserves on Earth, stretching beneath approximately 174,000 square miles across 8 states, from South Dakota down to Texas. For decades, it has allowed farmers across the semi-arid plains to irrigate crops that would otherwise be impossible to grow at this scale. But the Ogallala is being depleted far faster than it can be replenished. In some parts of Kansas and Texas, water levels have dropped by more than 150 feet since large-scale pumping began in the mid-20th century. At current rates of extraction, significant portions of the aquifer could become economically unviable within decades. When that happens, the agricultural economy of the Western Plains will face the same hard limits John Wesley Powell identified in 1878. The Colorado River tells a parallel story. Divided among 7 states under a compact negotiated in 1922, during an unusually wet period that was mistaken for normal, the river has been over-allocated for most of its history. Today, in dry years, the Colorado no longer reliably reaches the sea. Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the 2 largest reservoirs in the United States, have spent years at historically low levels. Both crises exist almost entirely west of the 100th Meridian. East of it, they are, for most people, abstractions. The environmental divide has, over time, produced a political one. West of the 100th Meridian, the federal government owns an extraordinary share of the land. In Nevada, roughly 85% of the state is federally owned. In Utah, the figure is around 65%. In Wyoming and Idaho, the federal government controls nearly half of all land within state borders. East of the 100th Meridian, federal land ownership drops sharply. In Iowa, Illinois, or Ohio, the figure is typically below 1%. This is not incidental. The arid West was harder to settle and harder to develop privately, so vast portions of it accumulated under federal management, administered by agencies like the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service. The result is a Western political culture in which the relationship between ordinary citizens and the federal government is not abstract. It is the land outside the window. Water rights, grazing rights, drilling rights, all of them negotiated with Washington, have shaped a distinct political identity west of the 100th Meridian, skeptical of centralized authority, protective of local control, and acutely aware that the resource which determines everything out here is the one the federal government manages most tightly. The pattern is not absolute. The West contains cities, universities, industries, and every variety of political opinion. But the tendency is consistent enough to appear, election cycle after election cycle, in the political geography of the country. The 100th Meridian, roughly, is where that identity begins to take hold. In 2018, a team of climate scientists, led by Richard Seeger at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, published a study in the journal Earth Interactions. Their conclusion was direct. The boundary between humid and arid America, the boundary that has tracked the 100th meridian for over a century, is shifting east. Driven by rising temperatures and changing precipitation patterns attributable to human-caused climate change, the aridity line has migrated roughly 2 degrees of longitude toward the Atlantic. It now sits closer to the 98th meridian than the 100th. In practical terms, this means that the climatic conditions that have defined the American West for recorded history are expanding into what was once considered the reliable, productive East. Parts of the Western Corn Belt, western Nebraska, western Kansas, and the edges of Iowa and Missouri are seeing less consistent rainfall than they did a generation ago. The same dynamics that hollowed out the Great Plains are beginning to press eastward. This does not happen visibly overnight. It happens in droughts that last a season longer than they used to, in aquifer levels that drop a few more feet each year, in farms that quietly go under and are not replaced. The 100th meridian was never simply a line on a map. It was always a description of where the American landscape runs out of the one resource it takes for granted everywhere else. For over a century, that description applied to the western half of the country. It is now applying to more. John Wesley Powell drew his line in 1878, and almost no one listened. The settlers came anyway. The farms went up anyway, and for a generation, aided by unusually wet decades and the easy confidence of a young country, it seemed like Powell had miscalculated. Then the rains failed. The soil blew away. The towns emptied. And the line held. Today, nearly 150 years later, the underlying science has not changed, only sharpened. The 100th meridian is not a wall, not a border, not a law. It is a threshold. On one side, rainfall sustains a way of life without much thought. On the other, every farm, every town, every glass of water is a negotiation with a landscape that gives nothing easily. Look again at those maps. Rainfall, vegetation, population, economy, politics. They don't share a border. They share a line. And that line, right now, is moving.